Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today we'll be discussing why Israel is not replaced in the plan of God in terms of the end times and how the church needs to wake up from the deception that is church replacement theology. And my special guest today is Derek Frank, and he is the founder of Israel Not Replaced. Derek, absolute pleasure to have you on the Middle East Report, especially as you've come all the way from beautiful Derbyshire to be with us and our wonderful viewers today. We work together pretty much with the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem, and you've made a number of appearances on Jerusalem Dispatch. So it's great to finally have you here on the Middle East Report.
Good to be with you.
Excellent. And Derek, just want to start off with how you came to faith in the Lord Jesus Christ.
Well, the extraordinary thing, I was just thinking about coming down this one, I can't remember a time I didn't believe in God. My earliest memory is of God's everlasting love, and I'll tell you how it happened to me. I was about 3 years old, and unfortunately I had an accident on my tricycle and rode into the family cupboard with all the china in. There was an enormous crash of noise. I did a lot of damage to it, and I think I was probably rightly fairly disciplined. I remember feeling God say to me, even if Mummy and Daddy don't love you anymore, I will always love you. And that is actually my first memory. Where that came from, how I got it, I have no idea. But it's traveled with me, this notion of God's everlasting love, really from the first memory. Well, I needed it. My father was very ill. He died when I was 10. I was a single kid being brought up with just by my mother. She had the challenge of bringing me up, which was a real assignment. And in God's mercy, I got introduced to Crusader Bible class, and there I was led to know the understanding of Jesus Christ, my Lord and Savior. And in the midst of this, you're probably far too young to remember this, but we had all these sort of choruses with sort of Dad's Army 1930s music, but basic sort of scriptures and truths. And those stuck in my mind. And to this day, I find myself humming these very corny little tunes, and yet these nuggets of truth. And so that's something that sort of traveled with me all through life, all God's gift. Fast forward to when I was a businessman, doing quite well in my 20s and feeling, that was the direction of things. And it was said I could sell ice cream to Eskimos. I never actually tried doing that, but I could sell most things. Other than one thing I couldn't sell, and I couldn't sell my soul to the system that demanded this. And I just felt God was calling me into full-time ministry. My mother was deeply shocked, and I remember her saying, even if God doesn't choose those who fit, he can at least fit those he chooses. And I didn't find that very encouraging. Then there were all my work colleagues saying, a guy like you going to do pastoral ministry, I feel, they were really anxious for the people I'd be caring for. They were saying, you're crazy, you could have a great innings in industry. And so it was really quite a sort of tricky switch out of commercial life into pastoral ministry. Extraordinary then, 30 years of week-on-week ministry followed, and we were ministering in the UK and in France, Switzerland, over in the US and other places. Extraordinary things followed, and this business, this principle really, that those who God calls, he is faithful to. And somehow it's almost as if more glory goes to him if we're not actually that suited, because then people see it couldn't possibly be him, could only have been the Lord.
Thanks for sharing that with Derek. So much of that I can relate to in my own kind of personal walk with the Lord as well. So also share with us also how you met your lovely wife, Francois, in all places, Jerusalem or Jerusalem.
Well, it wasn't just in Jerusalem. It was under a vine in the old city of Jerusalem. I met this very attractive French young lady. There's a whole backstory to this, because it was very difficult to get accepted for pastoral ministry with my profile. And even I realized I needed help. And so I was really, I have to confess, rather to name it and claim it back then. So I started naming and claiming the sort of wife I imagined that I would like. And then I was going out to Israel that summer, going with a group of theological students. I knew there were young ladies in the group, so I thought, well, let's believe she'll be in the group going out to Israel. And I thought, no, look, if you're going to do name it and claim it properly, you have to believe that she'll be on the plane with you. Actually, you ought to believe she can sit on the seat next to you. And I was doing name it and claim it like this up till the night before, and then I started getting a bit jumpy about this. Got down to Luton Airport, couldn't see what I looked like. I thought, oh my goodness, I've really sort of messed up on all of this. And then the seat next to me stayed empty. And I thought, oh Lord, I'm never going to get married. I'm going to be single for the rest of my days. Just before the plane took off, a little Jewish boy came and sat on the seat next to me, the skipper, and a Rubik cube in his hand. All through the flight, he played with the Rubik cube. Every time he got stuck, he'd take it apart, put it back together again. Get off the plane in Ben Gurion, and going down the stairs from the plane, I felt God say to me, your first love must be for people with a puzzle they can't solve. And I landed in Israel then with that, even before I was then to meet her. Well, I have to tell you, I met more attractive Christian girls in those next 2 weeks in Israel than I've met for years. Didn't even realize, I did meet her, but didn't realize she was the one. We met briefly back in England, incredible overlap, how she was back in England. We, real divine appointment, met again, realized we ought to meet once more. Night before I go down to meet her again in England, I felt God say to me, tomorrow, you must ask her to marry you. And I think, how do you know it's a word from God? And I really didn't know what to do. So I got down there trembling with this. I've got a question to ask you. She said, I know exactly what the question is. The answer is yes. So I said, you do know the question? Yeah, you want to marry me, don't you? And we hardly knew anything about each other, and that's 43 years ago, and we've traveled the journey together, and I'm only here today because of all she's done. But let me just tell you one quick story about her. I knew nothing about her. Only then did she tell me the story of her conversion. So she was converted in very pagan part of France by American missionaries. She'd never even really seen a Bible, let alone read one. They introduced her to the Bible. She starts reading, says to them, this book's not for me, this is for Jewish people, isn't it? And the missionaries looked rather sort of flabbergasted. And she said, yeah, but I'm not Jewish, I don't think I've got any. And they had to explain to her Romans 11, even though they probably not quite got it themselves. And that was her launching off into her heart for ultimately Jewish ministry. And it's really that shared passion God's given us, which through all the ups and downs of ministry and all the things you get involved in church life has always been the thing that's carried us forward together to this moment, which brings me here in front of you right now.
Incredible. And share your own story, Derek. When did the Lord place a love for Israel and the Jewish people on your heart, and how you've dedicated almost two decades to confronting
it was actually the year before that, my dear mother, who'd had the challenge of bringing a character like me up, retired, and it had always been her desire to do a pilgrimage to Israel. Now, we're back in the late 70s. It's not like jumping on EasyJet now and doing a trip. You would do a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and she wanted to do this, and I thought the idea of spending 10 days with her and a group of old biddies tripping around on a pilgrimage, this was not my idea of fun. And so very graciously I went with her, and I'd hardly been in Israel any time at all. We thought, do you know, I actually feel more at home here than I do in England. Now I know since then many people say, I'd never heard that. I didn't know that happened to people. And I was fascinated by Israel in the past, Israel in the present, Israel in the future. Then, because it was a pilgrimage, we had speakers and meetings in the evening. One evening there was a man called Lance Lambert, who's now with the Lord, but in his time was a very prophetic man, and he just produced his new book, The Uniqueness of Israel. Wow. Now, we're so used to internet and resources and videos and talks and everything. Back in the day then, things like that were just almost unheard of. And I actually got one of the very first copies of the first edition of The Uniqueness of Israel that's traveled on through the years, read this, and it absolutely just riveted my thinking. And it was like the planting of a mustard seed, the parable of the mustard seed. It was just a seed, but that seed over the years has become like the tree which has just grown and grown and just keeps giving. And I suppose the Lord's been saying to me, and my goal is to take that journey of 45 years and to take the product of the mustard tree, the mustard, and to try and get it, as it were, into process form in a tube that others only have to squeeze out, that they can put the essence of that onto their particular dish, wherever it is, whatever it is, and flavor it the way God wants them to do it. And that's the challenge in these latter years, to try and bring all that journey of the years into a focused, concentrated form people can get hold of quickly, apply it, and make the difference through it.
And just share with us, Derek, particularly in the times in which we're living in, post-October the 7th has intensified. We're having unprecedented rise in Jew hatred, a demonization of Israel that we've never experienced before. It was pretty bad during the second intifada around 2000, but nothing what it is like now. And then, of course, we're seeing, even with the kind of like the Bibas family that were murdered at the hands of Hamas, come back in coffins, the church is silent. Or it's very anti-Israel and very antagonistic. And yet the evangelical church do not understand the scriptures relating to Israel and the Jewish people. Just share with us where you think we are in today's kind of prophetic climate as we are heading closer and closer to those last days and the nations of the world are turning against Israel and the Jewish people.
I think the extraordinary readout was what happened on October the 7th, first of all, which was this incredible silence on the part of the vast majority of the church. And even more shockingly, what's happened since then, which is the church has sort of drifted toward the position of the world more and more. And what we've seen regarding Israel is how it's the world changing the church rather than the church changing the world. It is such a commentary on where the church is at. And in the vast majority of churches, certainly the local one where we live, Israel is just not talked about. It's like the elephant in the corner, because here's all the congregation. Nothing's ever talked about the greater context of God's redeeming purpose to Israel. They go back home, put on the news on the television or off all their new feeds, and it's Israel, Israel, Israel. And they are bombarded with the views of journalists about the latest thing which has happened, which even in worldly terms is like one little bit in the middle of a 3D chess match. But they are then having to build their construct for Israel out of the total vacuum of the church just not teaching about it. And no wonder then that people reach some very wonky conclusions about Israel. And so there is this void in which the devil can just drop in his lies, and you know his marketing phrase with all his lies, buy one, get one free. And this is what the devil does. One lie leads to another, and it grows out. It's like a sort of Ponzi scheme of lies, which just multiplies out and out and out. And in this environment, we have believers today who are facing the challenge of trying to understand Israel, and yet the church, because pastors have not themselves been taught about God's saving purposes through Israel, and that tracks all the way back to the Reformation and what came out of the Reformation, that total void about the place of Israel and God's purposes. We are reaping that big time today. Now, it's not all bad news, there's good news amongst it, but that is the greater scene, and it is a shocking scene as you see sincere Bible believers, people who truly love the Lord, they're truly saved, and yet with this enormous void, and which totally affects the way they understand biblical truth, and very particularly the times that we're in today.
Let's see this report now called The Need to Stand with Israel from our friends at CBN.
As protests and anti-Semitism rage over Israel's war against Hamas, many Americans, Christians and Jews alike, believe it is more important now than ever to support the Jewish state. Well, joining us is former CBN colleague Brian Sanders, the producer and director of the new documentary film, Why Stand with Israel? Brian, I know this journey for you began about 8 years ago, so tell me, how did it come about?
Well, thank you, Gary, for having me on the show. About 10 years ago or so, I realized that I had replacement theology, something that's pretty prevalent in the church and has been prevalent for centuries. And it's this notion that the church believes that God replaced his covenant people and land with the church. Now, we know what it says in Numbers 23:19, that God is not a man that should lie or change his mind. And so when I realized I had replacement theology in me, I quickly repented and even had some anti-Semitism, all being a believer in Jesus. And, you know, I found out that I wasn't the only one. So we are blessed to have this survey that Lifeway Research gave us, and it shows just how much a majority of the church is not standing with Israel, on how much that they're riding the fence with God's people, on where they stand with God's covenantal people on land. And so I realized that, you know, we have been grafted in, as the Apostle Paul says in Romans 11. We should be standing with Israel. There shouldn't be a disconnect within the church of why or who we should be standing with. If God made an everlasting covenant with his beloved people on land that he talks about so many times in Scripture. Matter of fact, Gary, no other nation God talks about in his word more than the nation of Israel, approximately 2,400 times. But yet there's a disconnect within the church on why they stand with Israel and the Jewish people. I mean, this is the only people that Father God sent his beloved Son to, and that's where he's coming back. And Jesus, well, his last name isn't Christ. He was fully Jewish, and his Hebraic title is called the Messiah, means the Holy One, the Anointed One. And so if God stands with Israel and the Jewish people, and it's the people whom he sent to, there really shouldn't be a debate. We should all be standing with Israel, especially now in this hour when the Jewish people in the nation of Israel need it the most.
Well, Brian, what can people expect in the film? What's it about? Who's in it?
Well, we're blessed to have people like Sid Roth, Paul Wilbur, Dr. Michael Oren, the former Israeli ambassador from Israel to the United States. We have Michelle Bachmann, former congresswoman from Minnesota. Dr. Michael Brown is also in our film. Dr. Wayne Hilsden, Scott Volk. So it's really a film to educate and inspire the global church to live out their biblical responsibility to stand with Israel. And so you might see some things in the film that you might not aware of how the nations are coming against Israel, like the European Union, for an example. They're actually taking land in Israel and giving it to the Palestinians. And you have to ask yourself, why is the global media silent on it? How come you don't hear much about that? Now, we know that the United Nations has been anti-Semitic and their bias toward Israel. We see that on a daily basis. But you're seeing it in other nations, the European nations, the European Union. We're seeing the anti-Semitism at an all-time high since the Holocaust on our college campuses that have gone completely rampant.
Well, I was going to say it's great timing. So what do you feel about being released right now as this is going on our college campuses and Israel enters Rafah?
Well, for such a time as this, I mean, I couldn't have asked for, that it would come out at a time when Israel needs it the most. If you were to ask me 8.5 years ago that this film would come out when Israel needs it the most, during a war, when a diabolical, horrific attack happened against Israel on October 7th, when the nations are coming against Israel like we've never seen it before. I feel like we're looking at Zechariah 12, when the nations are coming up against Israel. But the challenge here is the church is still remaining silent. We were silent during the Holocaust. We can't afford, as believers who have been grafted in with the Jewish people, as it says in Romans 11, to be silent anymore. God made an everlasting covenant with them and the nation. We need to be standing with Israel, especially now in this hour.
And what's the takeaway, Brian? What do you want people to know? What do you want them to walk away knowing about the film?
I want them to see God's heart on display. Why he chose this beloved people group. Why he chose this nation incomparable in size to the state of New Jersey. And why salvation comes out of Israel, comes from the Jewish people, because Jesus, Yeshua, says salvation comes from the Jews. He was talking about himself. He is the Messiah of Israel. He is the anointed one. He is Jerusalem itself is the city of God, the city of the great King. I pray they would see God's heart in his covenants and in his word, because you're not only going to hear scripture in our film of why God chose Israel and the Jewish people, but you're going to also see it. So for such a time as this, the church truly needs to be standing with the nation of Israel.
And that was thanks to our friends at CBN that really has placed everything kind of in context where we are in terms of world history and the challenges Israel and the Jewish people face now post the horrors of October the 7th. Derek, share with us how in the late 1980s that you believe the Lord spoke to you in an audible voice saying to complete the Reformation, and this led you to publishing a book called Escaping the Great Deception. So share with us this huge impact that the Lord had on your life back in the late 1980s.
Simon, it's an extraordinary story. We found ourselves in pastoral, and we said, Lord, first of all, took us to a great place of sort of social deprivation, and then in the way only God can do it, we ended up on the staff of one of England's largest charismatic churches. And all this roller coaster, in the midst of this, we have the Signs and Wonders movement going on with John Wimber, and healings and prophecies and incredible things going on. I was in the midst of this, healed of the illness that my father died of, which I'd got at the same sort of age, and there was very dramatic healing. This was amongst all sorts of things going going on with the Signs and Wonders movement. In the midst of all this, in the prayer meetings, I then started getting a vision, and it was a vision of like a sort of cathedral type building, and it was in a medieval era, people coming in and out and so on, and then it flicked inside modern day international conference, bilingual. It always ended up with the words, complete the Reformation, great big deep voice. This happened to me several times. No one could interpret, everyone's interpreting all these prophecies, no one can do this one. It did seem a bit above my pay grade as a young pastor to complete the Reformation, didn't know what to do with it. And it sounds like an exciting, it was very uncomfortable. I had to say to God, look, you either interpret it or you stop it happening, stop happening. I wish I got the exact time scale, but a year or two later, my wife and I were in the old city of Geneva. We're walking through it, and I see the exact place I'd seen in my vision. Absolutely, if I could pencil sharp, it was that accurate. And it was transpired to be the Cathedral of Saint-Pierre that Calvin had preached the Reformation out of. And I mean, that really got me then. I'd been trying to do a lot of reading to interpret it. I didn't understand what it meant. But I knew at that moment that I was onto something, but I still didn't know. This is before internet really gets going. So I start reading all these books. They're great big dusty things. You don't know what you're looking for. And in the midst of reading the Jewish encyclopedia, which is not bedtime reading, I came across this story about Geneva and how the Jews had been excluded from Geneva long before Calvin ever got there, and were only allowed, this is on a daily basis, they could go in and out if they paid. So it was only after he left, quite a long while later, that the Jews were allowed back in, which means that that city, which was a city of refuge for people who were displaced from the Reformation, Calvin would take anyone except the Jews. And this set me looking into, so if you then look at everything Calvin writes, there's nothing about Israel anywhere. So this was not, it would seem, accidental. As far as Calvin was concerned, Jews and Israel had nothing to do with the rediscovery of the gospel. There was no continuing place for Israel in his theology whatsoever. This then set, and it's a much longer story, researching, as it were, the whole backstory to Calvin and where he got his position from. And you end up understanding that at the root of all this was a lie that tracks all the way back to the Council of Nicaea, and it's a much longer story, of the omission of Israel from anything to do with the doctrine that creed, the Council of Nicaea, produced. They define the church, but they leave a void about Israel. This tracks forward through history. And I saw that how much this was a demonic deception that God had finished with Israel. This was the distinctive of the Reformation. It works on the basis the church has become, if only by default and only by inference, the new Israel. And as I then unpacked the implications of this, I saw what a powerful deception this was. And the only vocabulary you can use, the more you see it, is it's something that has to be escaped from. This isn't something you can just go along with impunity. And so this then set a much bigger journey going of understanding the great incompletion of the Reformation, which affects the church to this day. It affects the church that I would go to on a Sunday up in the Peak District in Derbyshire, where there is no reference to Israel whatsoever. It penetrates right down to the place most believers are actually standing in right now, that it has to be escaped from, particularly in the times in which we are.
Oh, it's absolutely extraordinary. And Derek, but showed us even where the great Reformation, published by Martin Luther back in 1517, failed to understand God's plans and purposes for Israel to such an extent that he wrote the book, The Jews and Their Lies, and towards the end of his life was writing kind of literature that was absolutely full of Jew hatred that Hitler even used to justify the Holocaust. So show us where Martin Luther got it so wrong.
Right, I think you have to, in a sense, slightly separate Luther and Calvin. Luther was like the door opener. He is the man who rediscovers that we are saved by grace through faith. And I would first of all want to stand up for Luther and say, this man was extraordinary. He was so determined to get right with God. Whenever he went to the confessional, the people, if they saw him coming, the priest taking the confession, they try and avoid Luther because he would keep them there so long. And they would eventually get through his confession. He would go, they'd breathe the sigh of relief. 10 minutes later, he's back and just remember something else. And he was passionate to understand how you could ever get right with God. And it was his passion that got the breakthrough that actually sets up the legacy that we just take for granted today, that we understand these things. Secondly, he was willing to take on the church of the day regarding the penances. And if you understand what that meant when he went to what's called the Diet of Worms, when he stood in the great, as it were, the great trial that he had called the Diet of Worms, and his great speech, "Here I stand, I do no other," one of the greatest pieces of oratory. This was a man then who was very favorable to the Jews, first of all. It was only when they didn't come over to him, although it was a sort of replacement theology, he thought they'd come over. Well, it was only when he didn't see them coming that he then turned against them and wrote this very, very vile book. Now, I just want to say, it's very easy to look at Luther and say, wow, he really messed it at the end, and he did. I don't know what spiritual battle there was over this man. I don't know how we should really understand. We leave that with God to judge. So the great lesson of Luther's life is how you can start well and end badly, and that alone is a case study in its own right. Calvin, though, was the one who really, as it were, set up the DNA of the Protestant Church, which is what comes down to you and me and makes us the Protestants we are. And step out of thinking of anything Christian, just think of nationality. I have a French wife, she has an English husband. Sometimes I become a bit aware of her Frenchness. Other times she becomes a bit aware of my Englishness. And who's right, who's wrong? I led a church in Geneva with 30 or 40 nationalities. They all think their version of understanding life is the right one. Where do we get it from? We get it from our ancestors. We're born into it. Where do we get the Protestant thinking from? We're born into it. Where did it come from? It actually came out of the Reformation, where Calvin sets up this construct. You can have all this doctrine, brilliant as it is, without any reference to Israel. And if you want to test out the extent that it permeates the church this day, look at any statement of faith of a so-called good church and see if it makes any reference to Israel. Because if it doesn't, what it is saying, you can have all this doctrine without any reference to Israel, means God's finished with Israel by default. We must be, as the church, the replacement to it. Now, here's the incredible thing about Calvin. Calvin was utterly forensic in his theology. If you've ever tried reading his Institutes of the Christian Religion for bedtime reading, you will find it's hard work. He is forensic. But what he thinks is the church is replacing Israel. Now, what a nonsense this is. I mean, if the church were to have replaced Israel, that means God had to move to plan B. The God of sovereign understanding that we know to be trustworthy had flunked it. He got it wrong, had to use some others. Is that God? He had to renege on his promises to Israel. Does God really renege on his promises to Israel? Why does Paul, for example, in Romans 11, if there was an old Israel and a new Israel, why didn't he explain that to us rather more carefully? You can go on and on. I could give you a long list, a yard long, of the nonsense conclusion that if the church is the new Israel, take it to its extremity, it gets to nonsense. How did Calvin not see that? The answer is, when he and the other reformers took their baseline for re-establishing the Christian faith, they only went back to the 3rd and 4th century church fathers. They did not go back to the baseline of the first believers. So the church fathers like Augustine, they were heavily into replacement theology. They were the product of Nicene Council and the Creed. The first believers were at a totally different point. They were all Jewish. They had this. They didn't have the New Testament. All they had was the old prophets to try and work out. They used to have God on the outside. Now they've got him on the inside. How do you understand? Well, how about Ezekiel 36? You know, heart, stone from stone to that makes it. That's what's happened to us. Let's look at Ezekiel 36. Well, the extraordinary thing for them is the verses before utterly describe the Israel of their day. So, but let's look at the verses that follow heart, turn from stone to flesh. Well, that's all about the restoration of Israel. And they realized that they brought that together. They didn't know how it would work out. The one thing they knew was God had not finished with Israel. And that was the difference. Their baseline, God's not finished with Israel. Calvin, the reformers, God has. That is the difference. And that so shapes the DNA that we have and needs to be altered right now before time moves on any longer.
Derek, thank you. I didn't know. I learned something new there. Thank you so much. Just share with us also, particularly when it came to John Calvin, why did he miss God's plans and purposes for Israel if he was so diligent as you say, was surely it's there. You read from the book of Genesis right to the book of Revelation, Israel's there. And of course, Paul's wonderful Romans 9, 10, 11, you can't miss it. So was he influenced by the religious political pressure, or did he just have that spiritual blindness where he couldn't connect the dots?
Well, I think that with all of this, you have to distinguish between the earthly story and the spiritual story. So we could talk for hours about the earthly story, and there are any number of little nuggets I could give you which would help to explain it. But really what you have to see is the backcloth to all this is the spiritual battle. And it's a little bit the iceberg thing. You see the tip of the iceberg and 9/10 under the surface. I turn it other way, inverted. Imagine an inverted iceberg, and what we have on earth is just the 1/10, the other 9/10 is the spiritual battle in the heavenly realms. And this is where you have to go back to the whole hatred of Israel, which you see as far back as the book of Esther, where the devil is seeking to destroy Israel out of the sight of the world. When Yeshua comes and he sees, when the resurrection, there's no way you stop people getting born again. He can't reverse the resurrection. All he can do is try to disempower believers. And there starts this strategy of the devil to deceive and to lead God's people either astray or to get them cut off from their Jewish roots. And so in a sense, by getting them cut off from the roots, the analogy you can say is that they don't understand where they've come from. And we all know in life that one of the things we all need to know is where we come from. If we don't know where we've come from, we're adrift in life. Or you could imagine a ship cut off from its moorings, can drift anywhere, and who knows where it foundered, it'll go wrong. This is the devil's strategy: to cut off, to deceive, to distract, to destroy. And you have to go back even from Calvin and say, when Constantine got converted, well, this was really the watershed in about 315. Constantine gets converted, declares the whole Roman Empire will become Christian. But his version of it becoming Christian is totally severed from anything Jewish. And it's that which sets up the Council of Nicaea and the creed which follows. And it's like the battle that there was over the apparent expansion of Christianity, but without any reference to its Jewish roots. So there's a backcloth we could talk about much, much more. But when it comes to Calvin, he is only one of any number that you can say. So why was Augustine like he was? This man who wrote much brilliant theology said also the most anti-Semitic things. And we have a backcloth of the way that the devil can sow lies into people. Goes right back to the Garden of Eden, his whole strategy saying to Adam and Eve, did God really say? And all that happens again and again and again through history, and is happening to this day. The devil sows the seed, effective into the minds of pastors. Did God really say that Israel has any ongoing significance? And he is sowing that lie constantly. And so Calvin is only one of many, many case studies of the same strategy of the deceiver to blind people from God's continuing purposes through Israel.
But when the likes of you, ourselves, and the vast majority of our viewers have that biblical understanding of Israel and the Jewish people, and in light of that, when you start to question the kind of great reformers, whether it's John Calvin or Martin Luther himself, you cannot get past their complete hatred of Israel and the Jewish people, and not believing that the Jewish people have a special place in the plan of God. Show us how you kind of reconcile yourself with that.
Well, looking at the world today, we're in extraordinary times. Serious times, highly significant times. And you look at the world, and looking at just the secular world, I think you see two things going on. One is that most people feel this thing is going downhill at such a rate. Maybe we can put the brakes on a bit, maybe we could steer around a few corners, but it's only going to be a time before it all crashes. Meanwhile, there's a sort of Second World War mantra going on saying, keep calm and carry on, and I hope that if we just keep carrying on, it actually will come around. That's the sort of secular construct at the moment. The biblical construct, just go to Matthew 24, and you have a description of the times about the rise of deception, about the rise of wickedness, nations against nations. There's this sense of we are into a zone which Messiah Yeshua described would apply right in the end times. So in terms of reconciling to ourselves, there's the secular construct, but we have a frame of reference, and all it is an ark which started from God's first calling of the people of Israel, these people who did not ask for it, did not deserve it. This was the way God expressed his grace, to be a kingdom priest and his treasured possession. There is this great ark, the whole story about how God used the way he revealed himself to and through them to reveal his character, his heart and his purpose, the coming of Messiah Yeshua, who enables Israel to become the people they couldn't should if they had received him. And this ark, he's like the tipping point, this ark which goes right over to the completion of God's purposes. And we are somewhere right over on that end time. We don't quite know how near, but we are pretty near at the very least. And we're in a zone of both problem and opportunity that is extraordinary, because can you imagine the prophets of 3,000 years ago saying, hey, I'll swap places with you if there's any way they could be around to prophesy at this time. They would spot the opportunity of our times just like that. Now, it is a problem for us as believers how we live in the world and carry out Christian construct. But one of the great rays of hope is in Matthew 24, is that Yeshua still says, but there will be the preaching, not just of the kingdom, but of the kingdom of God, which will be to the ends of the earth before the end comes. So here we are, faced with all this, but there is like this root of truth through it all that God's saying. Now, if you step into that stream, this is the season of golden opportunities of believers to be preaching, teaching the gospel of the kingdom, which is ultimately the kingdom being the final reign and rule of Messiah Yeshua from Israel, after Israel has come back to him. And this, I suppose, Simon, will be your final Middle East report. That's where it all leads to. And we can step into that stream which flows through to that. We need to recognize what it's about. And of course, Matthew 25 is all about the foolish and the wise bridesmaids and the challenge of recognizing the times and that actually being prepared, and not just preparing for the problems of the times, because things are going to get harder and harder for believers. How do we seize the opportunity, understand that great construct about how God chose to redeem the world the Israel way, which he is not far off completing?
Amazing. Thank you. That's a brilliant roundup of modern history, where we are now. Thank you. And biblical history as well. Share with us how over a decade ago the Lord helped you to produce a film called Let the Lion Roar, which really does confront the whole issue of how the Reformation wasn't completed and how the missing jigsaw in all of this was God's covenant plan with Israel.
Well, that's a whole other story, because I found myself pastoring a church in the old city of Geneva, just a few hundred meters from where Calvin used to preach. That's a whole other story, how I came to that, and an extraordinary place to be. And there's so many stories I could tell you about that one. But in a nutshell, there I am where I'm preaching to a congregation of 30 or 40 different nationalities. It's like doing church in the departure lounge of an airport. A tremendous privilege, all these nationalities who love the Lord. And in the midst of all this, I'm feeling acutely the crucial importance of helping believers understand the missing link. What I'd seen by involvement in many churches, how many different ways churches can work, and it is extraordinary how many different ways church does work. But what I'd seen was the common factor. I'd never met a church that did anything more than saying it only sort of worked. What was the one common factor? And size was nothing to do. I've seen them in the US. In fact, they're huge, doesn't make any difference. They still only sort of work. They have their strengths, they have their... What's the one missing factor across them all? And it's the absence of the understanding of God's continuing purposes through Israel. This started to become a burning issue in my heart. So one time after Christmas, some very kind people gave Frances and I a nice comfortable weekend at a spa retreat, and we're just lying there. And so she's off having a massage. I just open my Bible. It lands in Matthew 13. And it's just about really the merchant who stumbles across some treasure in the field, who sells everything to get the treasure. And I felt God just say to me in the midst of all this, look, how about it? And in that moment I thought, I know what I've got to do. I could go on up to retirement giving many messages to one group of people, or trade the lot for one message to many people. So, Christian film just rising up in the US, opportunities back then which weren't there before and haven't been there since, and it was a window of opportunity. We decamped to Nashville to Senior Christian Media to make the Let the Lion Roar film, which is a 60-minute docudrama, and it helps people who know nothing about church history to understand how the church got cut off from its Jewish roots and the effect effect that this has had. Now, it's a whole other story what happened to it. I was moderately okay about running an international congregation in Geneva. Making film in Nashville, Tennessee, this was something utterly out of my depth. It was the most shocking, amazing, extraordinary experience. We got so much wrong. It was utterly beyond us, and yet God used it. And the most incredible way, because of streaming, it ended up going out to 67 different countries. And these words I used about the God who calls is faithful. And in all our inadequacies, all our blunderings, God managed to get that message out through this film. And I think it's even coming up on Revelation TV in July.
I believe so. I believe
Still
so.
Being
so
used.
let's have a taster then. Let's have a taster for this incredible film called Let the Lion Roar. Take a look.
Almost 2,000 years, an evil deception has been sustained by key church leaders. This insidious conspiracy has stolen the church's identity. It has withheld the church's destiny. It has blinded millions. Until now. Deception is broken, the church will arise in its full glory. When this deception is annihilated, the church will be one. When this deception is rescinded, the church will finally operate in its complete power. All of this will take place once the ancient conspiracy is fully revealed. Discover the truth.
Escape the great deception. Escape the great deception. Escape the great deception.
So there you go. That's a little preview of that incredible film, Let the Lion Roar. So I have to ask you, Derek, share with us the vision behind it and how did you put that together? I mean, this was almost a Hollywood production with Christian stars starring in this film to make a powerful presentation that John Calvin didn't understand Israel, and that Israel was the key point in the Reformation. Also, how you got actors then to agree with this kind of line of theology? I know the States is very different when it comes to their support from Israel, but even so, that's still an impressive feat.
I think you have to put it down to God. We did not know what we were doing. But it was like pressing one of these doors. You know how doors sometimes fly open in front of you? And it wasn't just the door flew, we were sort of sucked through it. And this thing just took off at a speed we could not believe. So we ended up with Eric Roberts, who's the brother of Julia Roberts. We ended up with Stephen Bolton, who's the brother of Alec Bolton, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not just that, it's all the other people involved in the whole thing. It was absolutely extraordinary. But in the midst of all this, you get very taken up with doing the whole thing. But the purpose of it really was to try and get out this message of let the lion roar, which is a phrase, a prophetic cry you hear in Hosea and Joel and Amos. And like all prophecy, they have a relevance to the moment, they have a relevance for all time, they have a relevance to end time. Now, I think the first believers really got it about the understanding of the roar of the lion, the prophetic cry. It was part of what drove their boldness. Once the Gentiles come into the church, and the church gets less and less Jewish, they just don't have the Hebraic construct. And it becomes, as the church gets separated from its Jewish roots, there's just a void about this. And I mean, John 5, this whole picture of the lion of the tribe of Judah that John hears about, it's the only one who's able to open the scroll. That's what we wanted people to be led into understanding, that it's not just the sort of Gentile Jesus who just dies on the cross for my sins. friends to help me through life and takes me to heaven when I go. This is the Lion of the tribe of Judah who became the Lamb of God. We want to help people understand the whole Israel background of Israel and the Hebraic construct through this. And so this was the goal, to help people get beyond just this very simple understanding. Now, Let the Lion Roar, to be fair, you've only got 60 minutes, you do docudrama, it is only a door opener. But we just felt that God was saying he would lead us forward into other things if we set up the door opener to start off with. And the extraordinary thing, as I say, is God's opened the door to us through the film to help to open the door for others to make that first step beyond that very gentle understanding of the gospel, just the gospel as a personal gospel, understanding the greatness of what it is to be involved in the outworking of God's redeeming purposes through Israel. That was the goal. He did it. Glory to him. If we'd have known 10% of what was going to be involved, we'd have never touched it.
Amazing, amazing. And Derek, show us how you even got the likes of Kevin Sorbo to get involved. And of course, our viewers will know him from the whole series God's Not Dead, a very popular and charismatic Christian actor. How did you get him involved, and what did he think about playing John Calvin, and what was his understanding after he featured in your film Let the Lion Roar?
Well, the way it actually all happened was we didn't start up at that level. We started getting lower level people. But the extraordinary thing is, when you get lower level people, it then encourages more and more people to come in. And it was God built this before our eyes. Now, this all sounds absolutely wonderful. The only trouble was the finances. I mean, keep in mind, the idea of the film was birthed around the kitchen table in a little French village which we lived in outside of Geneva when I pastored there. And we were just going to put a little bit of money into this thing. Stopped because these people do not come cheap. And this thing just multiplies and multiplies and multiplies. And so we're signing things like this, just trusting God for it. And in my naivety, I thought, once you've made the film, you've done it. Oh no, that's the starting line. Then you have to get noticed in a noisy world. That is something else. And the challenge not only of even getting the cast, but to get it into places where you get known on Christian television, Christian radio, conferences and so on. You push, but it is amazing. It's a constant, this thing in all of ministry. There's God's part in your part. If you don't do your part, he doesn't do his part, but he doesn't do his part if you don't do your part. So you have to do this, but truly it is amazing how God took us through the whole thing and did provide, and we did live to tell the story. We didn't think we would at one stage, but we did, and we're still here, and glory to him.
Amen. So let's have a look now at this excellent interview with Kevin Sorbo himself, playing John Calvin in this great film, Let the Lion Roar.
Phones off. Marker.
Hi, well, my name is Kevin Sorbo, and I played John Calvin in the movie. John Calvin was a very interesting figure during the 16th century with his viewpoints. He was an important figure, but he was very loud and very brash in his beliefs.
Left for them are the curses found in the Bible, but none of the blessings.
This man was anti-Jew, completely anti-Jewish. But he had teachings. He was obviously a very bright man, but he was totally influenced by Luther and Luther's teachings. And so he had a viewpoint of the whole world of the Jews and how they didn't have a right to anything in this world in his mind. Being that the fact that they betrayed one of their own people in Jesus. And he makes it well known during this movie where his viewpoint is. And thank God there's a rebuttal and there's an alternate way to look at saving what this man was trying to do all over Europe. And this film really deals with, I think, a lot of different misconceptions that happened during the 14th, 15th, 16th century in Europe, dealing with the political aspects of the church, dealing with the different problems that were set upon during that time period and the different results that happened because of the teachings that were going on. I had a blast. I mean, I got to wear, to be on the set. It was a very short day for me. A lot of the people coming in here are just working a day or two on it, hopefully supplying their input and their talents to make this an interesting documentary for people. And it was fun for me to get into a character such as Calvin was, because I certainly don't have the viewpoints he has. And so as an actor, you get to step in these other shoes on occasion, and you know, just the clothing, the look, the beard, the hat, everything. It was fun. It's very well done. It will address a lot of answers to where we are in our world today, whether it's in religion, whether it's in politics, whether just the social life that's out there now with the different religions we have and the different viewpoints. And you know, you still see the anger and the frustration and the you know, separation between the different beliefs that people have dealing with religions. So it's an interesting film. It's a very smart film. It's a very interesting documentary of trying to point out the origins of what some of the beliefs we have in today's world.
And it's extraordinary to bring on big American actors on board with Israel to give them an understanding of God's plans and purposes for Israel and the Jewish people. Of course, one of the stars of God's Not Dead series, but they're being the star actor of Let the Lion Roar. What was the impact of this film? Because I know from it you had to do lots of TV interviews, and with any film there's a big marketing project as well. Did this kind of open up doors for you to challenge so many churches on their position on Israel and the Jewish people?
Well, here's the thing, to get the balance on it. 15 years ago, when we think about the replacement theology was scarcely talked about. 45 years ago, when I came in on the whole thing, never even heard of it. And here we are today talking about it. So the doors are open to talking about replacement theology. At the time, what was so shocking was it was possible to get on television. It was possible to get on radio. We could get into conferences, get into church. Was another thing entirely. And it was an extraordinary thing, even amongst so-called pro-Israel church, because this message, people are willing to say, we stand with Israel, but the idea you're grafted into Israel and all that meant, people sort of pulled back from it, and pastors didn't want the apple cart rocking in their churches. What I want to say is, times are moving forward. Extrapolate this going forward. I think we are in a very exciting time of opportunity to help people discover God's purpose through Israel, which didn't even exist 15 years ago. And theologically, you can see how it works out. Before Romans 11:26, all Israel will be saved, and who knows how it's going to happen, but time's running out fast. Romans 11:25 speaks of the fullness of the Gentiles. And many translations say the full number. That's a mistake. If Paul had wanted to use number, he'd have used the Greek word arithmo. He used the word pleroma. It means the quality of the Gentiles. Unpack what that means. There's two ways you can understand what the Gentiles are going to express. One is hatred toward Israel. The other is understanding and love for Israel. We are seeing hatred being poured out. That verse in Luke 21 about how Jerusalem will be trampled until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. It's the exact same word, pleroma. And this is what we're seeing, the expression of the Gentiles toward Israel, hatred increasing. But the opportunity for believers to get it about what it means to be grafted into Israel and to be used ultimately, even that Jewish people feel jealous because we've got what's theirs. We are moving increasingly into this, and there is rising opportunity. It's the same thing of the preaching of the gospel of the kingdom to the ends of the earth. This is the opportunity that we have. So yes, it is rough and tough when you get blocked and you try and share your best and people just don't want to know. But I would want to say that I believe amongst all that is so discouraging that's going on at the moment when the response of the church to Israel, there is still this flow, this stream of possibility to teach about this, to lead people into it, for them to live it out in ways that probably in not many years ago we wouldn't have even thought possible.
Incredible. And share with us how you've developed through the Lord this new platform that Israel's Not Replaced. So any viewers who are wanting to know God's plans and purposes for Israel can go directly to your website, Derek, called Israel's Not Replaced.
Well, we've produced lots of different resources over time, but one of the things that stood out, you can get people to step over, go through the door, as it were, into understanding more of what it means to be grafted into Israel. But people come at very different points, very different positions, academically, how they'd want to take it, spiritually, where they're at. So it's a very simple website. It's just starts off with 7 basic questions, but which can be expanded out, whichever route you want to go through, it all interlinks, and you could pursue any of them into other questions and other areas then to go digging. So there's sprint answers you can go through really rapidly. There is Dig Deeper, where you do your own study. Dig for Yourself, I give lots of other resources. So israelnotreplaced.com is to enable people just to do their own study and let God and the Spirit take them forward into understanding what it's about for them.
So let's go and see this excellent video produced by Derek called Israel is Not Replaced.
Today's Israel is such a hot topic that many believers avoid it altogether. Meanwhile, a 2,000-year-old lie is creeping forwards, undermining their faith in ways they don't realize, which is that the church has replaced Israel to become the new Israel, disconnecting the Christian faith from its Jewish roots and all that comes from them. But IsraelNotReplaced.com gives easy access answers to 7 key questions that take the lid off the lie without getting contentious, and provides truth that can transform our walk with the Lord. So if you've only got 2 minutes, click the Sprint Answers link. Just a bit more time, click the Key Questions link, starting with, what am I missing out on if I don't do Israel? More time still, follow the Dig Deeper material that leads to Dig for Myself. And if you find this content helpful, please share it with everyone you can think of.
So Derek says you can easily download that from his website, which is Israel Not Replaced. It's also on YouTube. So why don't you share that on social media, send out to your Christian friends who don't know an understanding of Israel, and it may open up a very interesting conversation about God's plans and purposes for Israel and the Jewish people. But 2 minutes left of the program, Derek, and it's been absolutely fascinating having you here on the Middle East Report. Share with us the consequences of the church if it doesn't wake up from its deception that is church replacement theology. And what does it mean for the church then to wake up and realise God's plans and purposes? Where will that place the church?
We're in a point of pivotal opportunity. I think it's going to go one way or the other. I think we've been able to drift along in a generalized position now, and people are going to have to decide where they stand on the Israel issue sooner or later. The truth is that the church without Israel is like a partially sighted church. They're not blind, there's much that is true. It's got truth, it's often got stuff which is nothing but the truth, but it's not the whole truth. If you don't have the whole truth, you make lots of wrong conclusions. When there's spiritual blindness, it is the blind, this partially blind leading the partially blind. And there is hazard which lies ahead for any person, I believe, who doesn't understand the greater purposes of God, both in terms of what it's going to mean for their foundation they stand on and whether or not God will be able to use them as he wants to in this last generation. I believe we could well stand before God and he will say to us, what did you do with the privilege that I gave you to be alive in one of the last generations? Did you just ignore it? Did you use it? It's a question I'm going to be held accountable for. If we are not loving Israel as God loves Israel, we have to be distanced from him. There has to be a gap. We're not wired up as we should be. We're not standing in the authority and the power that we have. We're vulnerable to the devil hitting us this way and that way and the other way and his lies. It is a time of deciding, will we go this way or that way?
Brilliant way to end the programme. Derek, it's been brilliant having you on the Middle East Report. Thank you for doing an excellent job. And I just want to thank you for watching this programme at home. I think we are definitely living in very serious and very treacherous times. We're also living in exciting biblical times. So if we truly want to know God's will and purpose, then we need to read the Word and understand God's purposes for Israel and the Jewish people. So thank you for watching the Middle East Report.